In this video, I'll show you my technique for painting a simple seascape using Corel Painter 12. So let's go ahead and get started. In my example here, we have a nice sky and some distant hills or mountains, a little cliff here on the side, some water of course, and it's splashing onto these rocks, and then there's a beach with a really cool sand texture. So I'll show you how you can make all this. I'm going to just close this example here. And behind it I have a canvas that I already made. It's 11 inches wide by 14 inches tall at 72 dpi. And I went ahead and painted in a sky already just to save some time. You can watch one of my videos on sky and cloud painting to figure out how to do this. I basically just used an airbrush to paint in some color here. So let's get started by making a new layer. We'll call that C, and I'm going to make sure that preserve transparency is not turned on. The best way to make a horizon line that's straight is to use the rectangular selection, and I'm going to draw a selection in here where this light area is, because that's where I want my horizon to be. I want it to be lightest at that point. And then we're going to fill that selection quickly by using the paint bucket here. You want to make sure that your fill is set to current color. And let's take a ocean color, something like this, a kind of dark teal. And we'll tap inside this selection to fill it with that color. I think I like that color. I'm going to do a Control D to deselect that selection. And now let's make a new layer, and we'll move it underneath the C layer, or behind it, and we'll call it hills. We'll put some distant hills in here. Take a lavender gray color, something like this, and we'll use the custom scratchboard tool, which is just a scratchboard tool from the pens menu. I just tweaked it a little bit, but any scratchboard tool will work. And I'm going to hit tab on my keyboard to make my palettes go away temporarily, and I'm just going to draw in some hills here and do something like this. Like that better. Okay, now let's lighten them a little bit by using the digital airbrush and turning on preserve transparency so that we can only paint inside this mountain shape. And let's use Alt on our keyboard to sample this lighter background color. Hit tab again to make the palettes go away temporarily, and we'll just lighten the bottom edge of these mountains. We'll use some brush strokes that are like this, but we'll do a much lighter to make some definition on our mountains in the distance. We want it to be subtle, so I'm going to use a lighter pressure. I don't want them to be too obvious here. Okay. Let's add a little bit of shading to our C layer. So let's go back to the C layer. We use a pretty big airbrush in the same color that we have selected. And let's lighten the top area a little bit where it's nearer to the horizon. Something like that. Okay. Towards the bottom, let's darken it a little bit. So let's shift towards blue here, get a dark blue color. I'll paint in some blue at the bottom here to darken it. Okay. Now let's really quickly, let's indicate where our beach is going to be. So let's put in a layer, call it beach. Turn off preserve transparency. We'll pick a sand color here. Something like this. We'll use the digital airbrush. Let's also set the blend mode to gel cover for this one. We'll use a pretty big airbrush. And we'll paint in some sand here. Sometimes this gel cover does some weird things, so let's try normal, see how that looks. I think that looks a little bit better actually, so let's just leave it on normal. Now we want our line, our shoreline to kind of curve like so that this side goes up and to the left and this side goes up and to the right, because our perspective's central here. We also want there to be some kind of perspective over here on the sides too. That'll make it look cool. So I want to do something like this. Try to have it be really opaque at the bottom and then just kind of feather off as you get into the water here. Looks good. Let's add some texture to that layer. So let's do a selection of this beach layer by right-clicking on it and then do select layer content. We'll do Control-Shift-H on our keyboard, add a new layer, make it a multiply layer. We'll call it beach text. Whoops. Beach text for beach texture. Take a darker color here, and we'll take a sponge with a pretty large brush size. We'll throw in some texture here. Use some different sizes. And let's turn down the opacity of that layer to kind of blend it in a little more. That'll work. We'll use the diffuse blur blender to lightly blend it where it kind of starts to enter the water. We don't want it to be too crisp there, so just blend it to soften it a little bit, and then I'm blending it kind of horizontally, lightly towards the bottom, just to blend that texture. That'll work for now. We'll add some more detail to the beach later, but now let's go back to the sea a little bit. So on the sea layer, let's do a selection of the sea layer to make sure that we don't paint above our horizon line. So let's right click on the sea layer, do select layer content, Control-Shift-H on the keyboard to hide the selection. Make a new layer, we'll call it CSH for sea shadow. And we'll take a kind of dark blue gray here, something like this. Set the blend mode to multiply on the layer. We'll use the palette knife for this. Make sure the opacity is set to something around 15. And we're going to put in some shadows and things of waves, but what we want to do is we want to make sure that in the background these details are thinner and closer together, and in the foreground they're broader and further apart. That'll make it look like there's some perspective going on. So I'm just going to kind of just put these in wherever. I'm kind of doing some kind of wave shapes here, or gestures, when I'm brushing. And then again, in the foreground, you want your waves to be broader and more distinct, something like this. Okay. Now we can add a little bit more definition to them with light pressure by kind of pulling down some strokes. We want to follow our perspective, which again is central here. So we want the waves on the right, we want the strokes to kind of go up and to the left like this. And on the other side we want them to do the opposite. We only need to be concerned about the ones in the foreground doing this. The ones in the background are just going to be kind of thin and flat. Something like that. Go through with light pressure and kind of darken it a little more. So that's kind of where our waves are going to be. Turn down the opacity a little bit to blend them in a little better, because I think they're a little dark. Now let's make a new layer on top of that. We'll call it CHL for sea highlights. Make it a screen layer. Take a light blue like this. Same brush. We want to go along the top edge of these wave shadows that we put in and add some foam. Mainly on the bigger ones. The ones in the background we don't really have to get too precise with, but you definitely want to be on the upper side of this shadow, and the foreground ones. And you want to try to get them all. Okay, and then in the distance you can kind of just do like what you did with the background and then just kind of put them in wherever. And again, like we did with the shadows, you want to try to put in some details but have them kind of emanate towards the center or from the center where our perspective is. So if you don't, you just do everything straight across, it's going to look like a river that's just moving sideways. We want this to look like it's coming at us. The water is coming at us because the tide's coming towards us. That's the direction the water's flowing. So you really have to have that, otherwise it's not going to look like an ocean. It's going to look like a lake or something, or a river. Let's establish where our water line's going to be too. So we'll use a thinner brush here. And I'm just kind of separating where this sand color meets the water color. They kind of have this sharp division here, and I'm going to enhance that. So what's dark green is probably going to be underwater, and what's not green is going to be, you know, dry land. Something like this. You could put in some little ripples and foam details here towards the edge if you want. That'll work for now. Okay. Let's do some blending now of this sea layer. So I'm going to go ahead and just merge these three sea layers together. So I'm going to hold shift down and I'm going to select from the CHL layer to the sea layer to make a selection of all three. And I'm going to do a Control E to merge them, and then I'm just going to rename them C. And I recommend that you save periodically while you're doing this in case something happens and your program crashes. So I'm going to go ahead and save now, just in case something happens. And if you want to save multiple copies of a file, you can. So you can have save number 1 and save number 2 and so on. That's an even better practice to follow. So on the C layer now that I fused into a single layer, I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency, and I'm going to use my coarse oily blender with these paper texture settings here. I'm going to blend a little bit. In the background, I'm going to blend kind of mostly horizontally, but I'm still going to kind of use some of those wave gesture shapes. And then when I get closer to the foreground, I'm going to blend with my perspective. So my perspective is going to kind of emanate towards that point. And I don't want to really like destroy my highlights or my shadows. I just kind of want to smudge them and blend them a little bit. Only really where it needs it. You don't have to do it everywhere. Something like that. You could spend as much time as you want doing this. I guess I should probably be kind of quick because this is just an example, but spend as much time putting in these details as you want. It'll just make it look even better the more time you spend on it. Fix some of these things in the background here. Okay, that'll work. Do you want to blend a little bit of this too? I see. Okay. Let's put some basic foam splashes going on here. So let's do it above all the other layers. Let's make a new layer and let's call it foam. And we'll set the blend mode to screen. Turn off preserve transparency. We can use this color that we have here. And for the foam, what we'll do is we'll use a square chalk brush. Set your color variability to 3, 2, and 2. If you can't find color variability, it's under the window menu and brush control panels towards the bottom. In that menu you'll also find brush calibration, which we'll need. You'll want to toggle on brush calibration and then go to the sub dialog here and then calibrate your brush by pushing down as firmly as you can to make a really firm stroke and then click OK. Then that way when we draw with this thing, it'll be really easy to pick up texture. Let's turn a paper scale and paper contrast all the way up, and if you're getting something like this, then that's good, that's what we want. So this kind of breaks automatically and helps you get some really organic, nice looking shapes for your foam. And the background, you don't really need to do as much, but these foreground ones definitely need some foam. Something like that. If we want to make some spray, we can do that on another layer. And for that, we'll use the pepper spray brush. Make sure your features are set to 4 and 3 and all these other settings up here. If you're using a brush with pen tilt, you might find that using the airbrush sprays everything out in a direction like that, and that might not be helpful, so you just try to keep your pen completely upright when you paint with this. And when we paint in our spray, we want our spray to follow a direction. We want to look like the water, like the waves are throwing it. We don't want to just spray it around randomly. It has to flow, it has to pick a direction and follow it. So let's say our spray in this case is kind of going that way, and then over here it's going off to the side, and in this one it's kind of curving out in front, and this one it's going all directions. So you kind of just use your imagination and decide what's going on here. Now we can blend it a little bit, and let's also make this blend mode screen blend mode. We can blend it a little bit using the diffuse blur, and we want to blend following those same directions, so this will give our spray some motion. So you can see I'm picking a direction. If it's curving, this one's curving kind of like this. This one's going up and out. Same thing with this one. See, they all kind of have a direction that they're going, or multiple directions. That's what I'm trying to follow when I'm blending. Oops. I'm using light pressure too. There we go, now it has some character. We can blend our foam a little bit too if we need to, the same way. Following a direction, light pressure. There we go. Might tint that foam layer a little bit too. Turn on preserve transparency, and then we'll sample our background color here and use the digital airbrush to in a couple spots. Just make our foam a little more blue. Every now and then I like to zoom out and see how it looks from afar just to make sure it looks right, and I think that's looking okay for now. Let's go through and add a little more detail to some things. So let's make a new layer above everything. Well, actually, let's put it below the spray layer. Let's call it WL for waterline. Turn off preserve transparency. We'll take a lighter blue color and we'll set it to screen. Take the loaded palette knife, and let's just add in some more details here, ripples and things, and maybe enhance this shoreline a little more to make it pop out in some places. And I'm kind of following these contours that we established earlier and the directions that they're going. In the background, I'm just going to put in some little choppy waves like this. Kind of fill it in and make it look less flat. Okay. Back to the C layer. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And this needs a little more blending done, so I'm going to set these paper settings back down a little bit. I'm going to use a smaller brush and really get in here and blend some of these a little bit better. Okay, that's looking better. Now I think that the background doesn't need to be so sharp, so we can put it a little more out of focus by going to the hills layer, setting it to gel cover. We need to deselect our selection that's still hidden. Sometimes I forget about it. I'm doing a Control D, and then we'll go to the blur blender brush, and we'll just blur lightly the top edge of this hills layer a little bit here. That sets it off into the distance. We'll do the same thing with the sea layer, just right along the edge. And then we need to also set this to gel cover. Let's use the diffuse blur a little bit too on this, just to kind of, with light pressure, to kind of break it up a little bit and make it look more distant. We'll fix this a little bit more when we get towards the end. I know it's got this kind of stark line here, but we'll blend that out. Let's add some more detail to our sand. So let's go above a beach texture layer and let's add a new layer, and we'll call it sand. Set the blend mode to screen and just sample our sand color here by holding down Alt on the keyboard. And then for this we'll use pixel spray, which is an airbrush. Make sure that you're using these settings I have up here. We'll use a pretty big brush for this. Go through and spray in some sand. Like this. So you want it to be a pretty good distribution. You don't want it to be too thick. Like, you don't want it to be thick like that. You just want it to be sparse, kind of, but full at the same time. We can mask off some of that by going to the digital airbrush and selecting black, turning on preserve transparency, and then where the sand goes into the water, we can just dim it or erase it a little bit so it's not going in the water. Okay, turn on the transparency of this layer a little bit to kind of blend the sand texture in a little better. Then let's make a new layer on top of that. We'll call it pebbles. Let's save right now just for the heck of it. Doing a Control S. Pebbles layer, we will use a pepper spray brush for this, and you can keep your settings here as they are. Take like a dark brown color, and with a bigger brush just kind of pepper in a few bigger rocks here. You can switch and use different colors. You can change your feature, bigger or smaller. Let's do some that are 1. That'll make them look like little tiny sparkling specks there. And we'll maybe make some that are 8. But very few bigger ones and lots more smaller ones, something like that. And we can just use our eraser here to erase some of these ones that are getting in our water. There we go. So now we got something that looks like a pretty good beach. Now if you zoom in, you'll notice it might need to be blended a little bit. So let's go to the sand layer, and let's use the diffuse blur brush to blend it with light pressure horizontally a little bit. There we go. And And then where it kind of gets in the water, we can really blend it to help it kind of come together. Okay, I think that looks much better. Let's add let's add this cliff in the background. Add a new layer. Call it cliff. And we'll use the palette knife for that. We'll select this purple color here in the background. We'll just darken it a little bit. Make sure that nothing's selected by doing a Control D, just to make sure. And then we'll put in our cliff here. If we want to make it look tall, it has to be above the horizon line. Let's also set our opacity to 85 so that we don't have to try so hard to fill this in. There we go. And you can make any kind of shape you want here. You don't have to copy me exactly. Go ahead and move it above this waterline layer here. So I noticed some things were getting in front of it. Okay, and then we can turn on preserve transparency. We can start adding some shading to it. So let's say use a lighter tan color here. We'll put in some flat top here. Put a highlight on this part. This is kind of all be the area where the light's hitting. We can put in some shadow. Let's turn down our opacity on this brush to 15 again. Add in some shadow here for this. Throw some texture over it using the sponge. There we go, we've got a little bit of a cliff in the background. Let's go to this waterline layer and let's put a waterline between it. So let's turn off preserve transparency and take this lighter blue color here and the palette knife, and we'll kind of separate it back here so it looks like there's waves coming up against it. Okay, let's put some rocks in the foreground. Let's make a new layer below the waterline layer, and let's call it rocks. You can use this palette knife again, set the opacity to 85 so that we make more opaque strokes. And let's pick a dark red color like this. And let's put in some rocks that are, let's put them actually, oops, let's put them on top of all the layers right there. So it looks like the waves are behind them, splashing into them. Throw in some rocks here, wherever you want. I'm just going to do a few here because it's an example. You could put some on the beach too if you want. Okay, that'll work. We'll add some highlights to our rocks. Pick a highlight color here. Oops, we need to turn on preserve transparency. See the light's coming from the right more or less. Add some texture with the sponge, sampling this dark color that we used a minute ago. If we want to add some character to these rocks, we can use the square chalk brush. Pick a paper texture like that, and then a little bit lighter of a color. And you can just vary the color a little bit between each rock to make them a little bit different. I think it needs a little more texture. Maybe something darker. There we go. It's better. If you want some reflections from your rocks, turn off preserve transparency. Set the blend mode to gel cover. Then we'll use a blender that's called just add water. And you can pull down a little bit on this rocks layer to pull down some of this color. Straight down. Just the ones that are in the water, of course. Then we'll go make another layer. Let's call this WL2. This will be a water line that's in the foreground. Again, take a kind of light blue color, set the blend mode to screen, take the palette knife, and then separate these rocks from their highlights, or from their shadow or reflections with some highlights. There we go, something like that. Maybe in a couple spots you could put some little water droplets on the rocks themselves, make them look like they're wet. Looks pretty good. Let's use this same layer to add a few more little details on the beach. Let's use the detail oils brush. And just here and there I'm going to draw some little squiggles and dots and things that might kind of look like bubbles. We can blend them a little bit. Lightly. Okay. That's about everything. Let's do one last thing. Let's add a vignette. Just to kind of make it all come together. We'll make that a multiply blend mode. Take a dark blue gray like this. Make sure nothing's selected by doing a deselect, Control D, and then we'll use a pretty big airbrush. And we'll kind of darken the top and the bottom. I'll make everything kind of come together in the center, and then we'll just take down the opacity of that layer, like so. We'll add a little more purple in the corners. That looks kind of cool. Maybe some green at the top, some of this sea color. And there you have it. That's some different techniques you can use to paint a seascape. Of course, you'd want to spend more time than I did on this, and, you know, really add more detail and blend some things together and add more texture. But this gives you an idea of how to do it. And if you want to get rid of this line in the background, once you're done with everything, you can do a layers and then drop all. You probably want to save it first before you do that. And it'll flatten all your layers into one layer. And then you could go through and blend this line a little bit so it's not so sharp. However you want. You could use the blur blender for that too. It might work better. Just be careful not to blur your cliff here. You could do it a little bit, I guess, to set it back. Finally, too, if you wanted to save it, you could add a new layer and you could put your signature somewhere on it. Alright, that's a seascape. Thanks for watching.